Hello, and welcome to another episode of Defense Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and issues in laser focused detail so that you build an accurate and informative big picture. So, this episode, I have Arslan with me to discuss the recent news of the US apparently clearing the sale of AIM-120 Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missiles, or AMRAAMs, to Pakistan through a quiet update to an existing contract to supply these missiles to many US NATO and non-NATO allies. Today we'll unpack if the contract means anything, and if so, what it could mean for the Pakistan Air Force's F-16 fleet, and more broadly, Pakistan's defense ties with the US for the next few years. So, without further ado, how's it going, Arslan?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you? It's been a minute.
Yeah, I'm doing good. So let's just get into the main story. So we saw yesterday that a $41.6 million addition was made to an existing contract to supply the new AMRAAMs to seemingly every current or active buyer of US aircraft or subsystems at this time. So with the exception of just Sweden and Pakistan on that list, every country there either has a fighter on order from the US, is a target customer for a fighter like Saudi Arabia, for example, or has a fighter compatible with the new AMRAAMs like Sweden through the new Gripen or Pakistan via the Block 52 and the MLU fleet. So that said, and you'll get into this, Arslan, but Pakistan, I believe, would be the only country on this list that doesn't have a known AIM-120 C8 or D deal at the moment. So typically we see these contracts reviewed and announced by the State Department, and no such deal was announced for Pakistan as of yet. But in July, the PAF Chief of Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Zahir Ahmed Babar, visited the State Department. So maybe something could come of it. But I'm going to leave it to you, Arslan. So how about you unpack this actual Department of Defense contract?
I mean, firstly, I think the visit was really, like, everybody forgot about it for some reason. And typically when we see Pakistani officials in Washington, the first thing that goes off in every Pakistani defense enthusiast minds is, F-16s. And for the first time, I think everybody just really ignored it. And this is now coming to fruition. So first thing I really want to clarify here is the contract addition is not a sale as per se, right? It's not a sale. The best way to describe it is sort of like the Pakistan Air Force's name is written in the order book. But, there is a long process that goes here. So firstly, the initial contract itself was for 4-point-something billion, and the addition was about 40 million. So the initial contract was, if I'm not mistaken, 18 states. And
it was originally around 2.4 billion. High 2.4, and now it's like 2.5-ish.
Sorry, yeah, the other way. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so 2.5 billion. So the original contract was I believe for 18 countries. And so this was a production contract. So this contract itself is for the production of new missiles. And I've seen people saying that, this is not a production contract, this is a maintenance contract, or it's a contract that encompasses maintenance. But the addition was very explicit in saying that this is a contract. So first things first, let's break down how this all works. And I believe, Bilal, you'll probably be able to chime in on into this as well. Is initially, the class justification and approval is a legal document that sort of provides the rationale from not opening up the competition. So the US government has awarded Raytheon this contract. This document is a justification for not making it an open tender, a competitive evaluation, sort of. So it authorizes a sole source contract. So as I mentioned, this contract has just been given to Raytheon. Nobody else has been asked about it, which obviously makes sense because Raytheon is the only one who produces it. So in this context, basically it establishes the sort of legal authority for the US Air Force to be able to give Raytheon a decade-long production contract, right? Without opening it up again. So the benefit of this is not just for the sake of it, but it's there to be able to determine and predict the future sort of orders. It basically gives the foresight to include an indeterminate number of future military sales partners. And this is sort of like cornerstone of the design of the FMS strategy anyway for this program. So basically, the purpose of this framework is to achieve aggregation of the demand. So by consolidating the needs of the US Air Force with a pool of partners, it creates a stable, predictable, high volume production environment, which then it prevents the whole stop-start of production cycles, and it also gives assurance to the OEM as well, so they can order in for example, long lead items or keep that relationship with suppliers up. You see, you stop production, for example, with the F-22 as just an example, is restarting this production. It costs a crap ton of money and it balloons costs and timelines. And this is what prevents that happening, right? It gives a stable outlook for the OEM. Now, this contract modification itself is involving new partners in, but this isn't the value of the individual contracts. This 41.7 million is not the value of the missiles sold or anything, or the value of the order of the missiles or anything. What this is it's likely just a combination of admin costs and other associated costs. So, for example, the key figure here is the $9.16 million. And by the way, when I reference these figures, it's coming from the original contract. So the key figure here is the 9.616 million in the FMS partner funding. This is obviously not referring to the missile. Again, this would buy you like 4.5 120Ds. It's the allocation of these and the purpose of these FMS funds is typically administrative surcharges. So this covers the US government's program management overhead and all of the costs incurred by the DSCA. And also the military departments that administer the case. This also covers the non-recurring cost recoupment. So this is a prorated charge mandated by US law, and it requires FMS partners to contribute to the US investment in the weapon system's original research, development, testing, and evaluation. It ensures that basically all of the allied partners and all of the buyers share the financial burden of the development of this technology. And also, this allows you to procure the long lead time items, right? So this is the most key application of the funds is this capital is used to place orders for critical subsystems and components that require the longest manufacturing and integration timelines. So these can include, and not necessarily limited to the stuff like, the motor or like guidance and control sections, or, stuff that you can't just ramp up production on a dime. And by funding these long lead procurements up front, the partner secures, once again, as I mentioned earlier, they secure their place on the production schedule, so they get their name in the order book. And it also mitigates the risk of delays when full rate production is eventually finalized. Also, the next sort of aspect of this all is the FMS system is fundamentally sort of bifurcated. So it operates on like two parallel tracks, right? The industrial track and also the political and the legal track, which I think, as with US procurement, the political legal track is always the more significant one. So in terms of the industrial track, as I mentioned, manages this, they manage all of the, activities related to the industrial base, and the primary actors here are like program managers and contracting officers within the DoD or DOW now. The objectives for these people is, production efficiency and schedule management and, stability of the supply chain. So the contract management, the contract modification here to procure stuff like long lead items is a really industrial, it's a really quintessential industrial action. It is a prerequisite, not an approval, right? So it just ensures that stability for this procurement. On the other hand, we've got the political and legal track. So this is the next step here, right, is going to be your congressional notification, right? So the DSCA notification. And this is obviously mandated by US law because there is a threshold. I believe it's 50 million, or it depends on, of course, the thing being exported, but there's a few thresholds. But off the top of my head, one of them is 50 million. So, for example, if the contract value exceeds 50 million for, say, air-to-air missiles, then it would require a DSCA notification and have to be approved by Congress and all of the legal entities that are in the US. So that's where the decision is going to come, right? That's where, once that DSCA notification goes through, that's effectively, we can say that this deal has gone through. And as I mentioned before, so there isn't necessarily a deal that's gone through here, but that's the point at which you're reasonably confident that something's happened. So this notification, managed by the DSCA and also the Department of State, is basically the definitive political act, right? It triggers like a statutory review period where Congress may block the sale. It also signifies that the proposed transfer has been vetted and approved as being within the foreign policy and national security interests of the US. And then the last sort of point, basically, this whole like procurement system isn't necessarily a bureaucratic thing, right? It effectively is an instrument of US national power and foreign policy. So it continues to ensure that there's a guaranteed baseline of work for their defense manufacturing companies. So, Raytheon can say for the next, 10 years, we've got this floor of orders, right? And again, it also ensures interoperability, and also, so that's basically a brief overview of the process. I think, Bilal, you've got some ideas about also how this all works. Would you might be able to add in?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo a couple of your points, I think, having Pakistan included on this list at one level shows that there were discussions between the PAF and Department of Defense, now the Department of War, on this matter and potentially other matters. So the fact of the matter is that, look, Pakistan's been added to an order book for the current standard of AIM 120, right? This is not like the C7 or even the C5. This is the current cutting edge standard that's available to all NATO and non-NATO allies who are buying, current American fighter aircraft. This is as good as it's going to get, right, for anyone. And I think with the DOW putting Pakistan on this order book basically means that they have, on their end, have administratively approved a potential transfer. And so this is like this will be the first in a very long series of steps, but it's a very important one. And the age we live in where all this information is coming out online, like this is not new from an administrative standpoint. I'm sure that in the older days when the PAF was negotiating for the F-16s back in the 2000s, back again in the early 80s, that this has been the process where first the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, now the Department of War, they would basically be in touch with their stakeholders in Pakistan. The PF would make its case, and eventually on their end, because this is their function, they're the main stakeholder when it comes to the transfer of this technology, right? They're the first ones who have to say yes or no. Like there's nothing the State Department or anyone else can do in the chain unless the department, unless the Pentagon agrees to it, right? So the Pentagon is the first big litmus test. And as you said, the $41.6 million here, in addition to Pakistan, probably includes some other administrative processes to get the approvals going, at least on the DOW front. Really, the next thing to look out for at this point would be the first DSCA notice, which means that it will have been reviewed by the State Department and approved by them for basically congressional review and approval. And I think given Pakistan's history with American arms purchases in the past, seeing a DSCA notice go through Congress has always invited very tough conversations, and typically that's where a deal would essentially get sunk with Congress weighing in. And Congress is itself influenced heavily both by domestic constituents who might have an issue with it, as well as lobbyists and so on. But I think just the current environment in America, the appetite for that kind of fight might be relatively limited. I think congressional members know that if they're going to pick a confrontation with the White House, they're going to have to pick their fights, and on an issue that could relate to American jobs, industry, exports, foreign relations, or basically foreign influence, geosecurity. I don't think there'll be many constituents or Congress members willing to pick that fight at this time. So I would imagine, I'd be surprised if we don't see a DSA notice happen within the current Trump administration.
Yeah.
I think this is being expedited potentially. The fact is, our chief of air staff had visited the State Department, and I think it's a very peculiar thing for him to visit the State Department, right? Given that in the wider context of things, we would perceive that the PAF is winding down its American arms purchases, and it was due to primarily, for the most part, 80% U.S. policy. Like, if not for American foreign policy, especially the pivot to Asia, the focus on China, and as a result, the urge to leverage India and to have India as a key partner. If not for that, I'm sure the PAF would have loved to continue engaging with America in terms of acquiring F-16s and what have you. Because when they invested in the F-16s in the Peace Drive deal, it was envisioned as a long-term procurement plan. Right? If you read the original Flight Global articles and the PAF statements at the time, they'd hoped for around 55 units. The original deal was for 18 units plus 18 optional units. And then in 2016, when they were, beginning to acquire follow-on units, they first had an order for 8 aircraft with plans for another 10 aircraft. So they're evidently working towards that. But of course, American foreign policy goals basically, for the most part, derailed it. And I think now, and this goes back to our previous episode that I had with Asim in regards to Saudi Arabia. One thing we did mention, I know we had a lot of pushback on that episode, but again, I urge folks to really give it a listen with a critical ear. And if you have actual points you want to refute, then I would recommend you actually show those points and we can discuss them. However, that being said, one of the things we said was that one thing that India approved in May was that any conventional military asymmetry with Pakistan, India will leverage it. So any advantage that India has conventionally, it will leverage it to its advantage. And in turn, it would become the destabilizing actor. And that's what happened in May. India was the destabilizing actor. And I'm not trying to say that it was good or bad. I'm just saying it is what it is. Like prior to May, the situation was relatively stable. After May 7th, it was unstable. What caused the instability? It was India, right? It's not an issue. It's not a normative or, moral judgment. It is what it is. It's like a cause and effect or just an observation. And I think from that standpoint, America finally probably took on what Pakistan has been saying for a long time, was that if there's a conventional imbalance, then the chances of instability go up. And I think America, at least currently, again, with American policy, things always shift, and we have to keep that in mind. At least currently, they have largely agreed with that assessment and are willing to now literally transfer ostensibly the best available munition for export that they have to Pakistan. What do you think about that, Arslan?
Yeah. Yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head. I just wanted to quickly just give a brief overview because I know I talked a lot. So the next step, as you mentioned, is the congressional approval. So just to start off, right? So the initial contract would be the master contract that's been assigned. It's an indefinite delivery, an indefinite quantity contract assigned to Raytheon. So this is the overarching agreement. It's not a contract to buy a specific number of missiles. It instead establishes pre-negotiated terms, conditions, and pricing over a long period. And it's a flexible agreement, right? It's effectively the entry into the club. Then the next, that's effectively the club. Then the next point is this, what's happened now. It's the contract modification. So it's issued to the master contract, which is the one that I just previously outlined. And this is the one, this is the procurement action involving Pakistan's funds, right? Whatever administrative costs they would have put in. And this modification serves as the delivery order for the set of goods, right? So this, again, as I mentioned, allows Raytheon to procure the long lead items, and it also legally authorizes Raytheon to enter into subcontracts with its own suppliers for critical components. And then this also establishes a program relationship covering all the administrative and engineering activities to add a new FMS partner into the production program and planning structure. The next part we will have is what we'll see next, rather, is the intergovernmental agreement, right? So we'll see the signing of a letter of acceptance. Now, obviously, we won't see this publicly, but this is what will happen behind the closed doors, or it might have even already happened, but we'll see that letter of offer and acceptance. And this isn't the procurement contract, but this is the legal agreement between the US government and the government of Pakistan. And this is effectively the purchase order from Pakistan to the US. So we've not got to that point yet. So it defines the total scope of the sales, right? So the exact quantity of missiles, spare parts, procurement, support equipment, training, and other services. And it also estimates the total cost and payment schedule. And this is the step that requires the congressional notification. So that DSCA notice is all of this being approved by Congress. Then after that, what we'll see is the main production contract. So we'll see a new large value contract modification or delivery order against that original contract that I mentioned in the start. So this is what you would call the missile purchase, right? And this would only be issued after the LOA is signed. And it would also give an obligation on part of the government of Pakistan to Raytheon. It would, yeah. So it basically, that's the final step. That's when everything's all said and done and agreed. So right now we're sort of halfway there. And the most difficult step is what's up next. We'll decide production numbers and all these sort of stuff. And then we'll send a notification to Congress, not us, the Department of War. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, and one of the questions that will come up is like, is this a prelude to a new F-16 order? And we'll get to that. But I think in terms of the current F-16s, from what I understand, the AIM-120C8 can technically work from the current F-16s, but they would be very severely underutilized because, number one, you do have a mechanically steered array radar. It's, its reliability in an ECM dense environment is very questionable. So whether you're going to get the range detection and targeting or the targeting reliability is going to be, up for doubt. However, on the other hand, you also have a much older mission computer data link architecture, so you're not going to be able to pass as much bandwidth to these missiles, so your ability to unlock the cooperative or collaborative engagement capability element, or CEC, is also going to be very limited, if at all. So basically, the AMRAAMs can technically be launched from the F-16s, but it really would not be a great purchase unless you're at least upgrading the F-16s you already have.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head mostly is, yeah, so effectively there's no limitation, as in they can be fired, they can be used. The Turks use 120C8s on their F-16s as well. So it's not infeasible. Even if you don't get the maximum sort of range here, you still have other benefits, right? The additional kinetic energy that comes from, you have a a more lethal missile, right? It will, if you're not extending to all your, maximum range, you've got better end game kinetic energy, you've got better ECM resistance, and one of the biggest benefits of the AIM-120C8/D3 is the addition of a two-way data link. Now, initially the AIM-120 can't. This is from the top of my head, so I could be wrong here. The 120 will stops receiving updates after a certain point, right? It's not a two-way data link, and it's also not fully guided in its terminal stage, right? So after a certain point, everything just goes dead. I believe it's when its own seeker kicks in, it stops feeding data. Well, the missile isn't feeding data full stop anyway, but the fighter loses its link with the missile. Now, with this new upgrade, you've got continuous communication with the fighter until the missile has hit its target. But also the other thing is the 120C8/D also introduces cooperative engagement capability to the AMRAAM series, which is something, again, that's never been done. So this whole concept of, sensor shooter, that can happen now. And also the 120C8 and D3 also supports that handing off the guidance to other aircraft. So, for example, if I launched a missile, a 120D, I can then hand off the guidance for that missile over to you, Bilal, for example. And this is, again, something the Pakistan Air Force has not had before, and it's a new technology, and it's a really serious upgrade to the original 120, more so than the Rangers. This missile brings a ton of new capabilities, and I'd argue capabilities that the Pakistan Air Force does not have until now.
I mean, I believe they had like some form of this. It was more like a wolf pack scenario where essentially the J10s could do it amongst themselves. So I know we had reports claiming that AWACS would be involved in the loop, but we don't have that architecture for that. However,
Yeah.
potentially at least between the J10s, this was doable. But I think with the F-16s, where it gets interesting is that if you could at least upgrade the newer Block 52s to the V standard, they would have that sensor node capability to manage the CEC aspect. However, even if the F-16A and Bs are just deployed into the air just to launch the missiles, they can at least defer to the F-16V to carry them the rest of the way. I think that's like the big opportunity gain here. So that suddenly it's not just 18 F-16s that can deploy. No, it's going to be the whole fleet. Is that the 18 that are the upgraded ones are going to be the main central management nodes for the CEZ, basically.
Possibly, but also in fact, there's two things I'm going to talk about here, and I'm just going to mention them both before I forget. So firstly, we'll begin on the what aircraft can fire this, right? So as far as I'm aware, all of Pakistan's F-16s except the 12 ADFs that were bought from Jordan are upgraded to Block 52 standards, except the engine, which makes sense anyway. So they all should be theoretically capable of firing it. They should all be on the same level, but they also should, so the F-16V upgrade, I believe, is Block 40 and up. So I'm not actually sure whether the previous F-16s can actually be upgraded to that standard. I'm not too sure on the numbers.
Taiwan has an iteration of the upgrade. So I don't know to what extent. I do know that they're able to install the new active ESA radar.
Yeah, the radar
But
for sure.
yeah,
But
it's the mission computers and the wider aviation stack. It's probably contingent on a lot of the pre-existing electronics that you have to have, like wiring and stuff.
So you could effectively have an F-16V like light sort of. But yeah, so point is it based off of that, then you've got like a hypothetical, we have got a fleet of what, 72?
No, so it's 18 Block 52s with around, so we lost a couple to attrition over the years, give or take 40 to 45 ABs. Of those, you would have around the 12 to 14 Jordanian ones, so roughly about 26 to 28 AB MLUs, give or take. So 28 to 32 MLUs plus 18 Block 52s.
So you've got
14 Jordanian.
You've got 40 aircraft that are theoretically capable of being upgraded. Of course, not all 40 will be upgraded because some of these airframes are ridiculously old and will be out, end of life or nearing end of life. So, potentially, so those will be sidelined, I'm guessing. And then you've got the ones that are in the best condition, they'll be cherry picked to be upgraded. To the newer standard, to the V standards. The other thing, you mentioned the whole like Wolfpack thing, and I actually saw this the other day, and this was the Indians. Their vision for the Tejas and the Loyal Wingman was sort of a little bit different, right? It's instead of having Tejas cue the Loyal Wingman with missiles over to attacks and targets, they wanted to reverse the order, and they wanted to use the Loyal Wingman as the sensor stack, and then the aircraft as the shooters. So I think that you mentioning that just brought that to my mind. And I think that's another really interesting thing that is now available to the Pakistan Air Force is is off-board sensing and then shooting separately, right? You've got shooter platforms and you've got sensor platforms, which I don't think is a capability that exists in the PAF at the moment. You can correct me on that, but it definitely doesn't exist with the previous AMRAAMs. With the PL-15, we don't know, but I can tell you for a fact that airborne early warning and possibly interfighter data links, they aren't able to guide off. They aren't able to guide each other's, missiles or whatever. That for a fact. But yeah, it just brings a bunch of new capability to the Air Force, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, we'll probably get into this in future episodes,
Yeah.
especially if a DSA notice does come out, because we're gonna mine the heck out of that notice
Yeah.
before the deal's signed. However, I think the opportunities are extensive in the sense that if the PAF, and I'm sure the PF is serious about building a robust CEC capability where theoretically any sensor can support a shooter. So in that sense, if you have the new F-16s, you have the AIM-120C8/Ds, you're going to want to update your your AWACS and your ground-based sensor nodes as well. So you have the TPS-77 from the US already, which is a new radar system. At some level, it could support it, but I think suddenly that conversation for something like the Global Eye becomes very tenable and all that, especially since Sweden itself is also buying this air-to-air missile. So you
Yeah.
imagine they would also build that compatibility into the Global Eye as well, because they're using that. So
Yeah.
a lot of things start to, you start getting we are starting to get a much better sense of where the PAF's direction is.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the F-16s themselves, I know we talked about potentially upgrading and cherry picking, but we do know that at the bare minimum, the PAF would be interested in at least upgrading the 18 block for use,
For sure.
right? They have tremendous life left into them even before any service life extension plan is brought into the picture. If you add that, you're going into like 12 to 15,000 hours, which is like incredible at that point in
Yeah,
terms
it's
of life.
insane. And also
However,
they can expect they can
yeah,
still stretch more life out of it. I think Lockheed Korea, they could probably get another 40% out. Something insane. It's insane, honestly.
yeah, it's a perpetual fighter, right? And
Yeah.
that's, I think, a big reason why the production line, I mean, even in lieu of new orders, America insisted on just moving the production line to North Carolina even before they got new orders coming in.
Yeah.
So it tells you that they know the fighter has the juice in it, right?
Yeah.
However, that being said, we did hint at that this could be a prelude to a new build F-16 order. And the way I look at it is, look, especially this current administration, it's a give or take, right? In order for you to get, you're going to have to give. And I don't know if an upgrade package is going to be the big thing, because I mean, Trump would want to go and sell this story to his constituents, or the Republican Party would want to sell the story that, hey, the F-16 production line is gone into 2040 now.
Yeah.
That means you got jobs until your kids graduate from university at this point, right?
The F-16 will outlive them.
Yeah,
Exactly.
basically, like your current production line, people are going to retire, and there'll still be F-16s rolling out the production line. So for them, getting a new build order from wherever it is, especially those, I think it was like that 10-year period of American policy that was very India centric that sort of put a dampener on this. But I think we are sort of returning, in a sense, to the way things were in the 80s and 2000s, where the American industry does want to, extract commercial gain through Pakistan, obviously, and the defense industry is a big one. And you have a very capable F-16 operator already there with the infrastructure and stuff. So it makes sense to get a follow-on order. However, I think for to even get access to this sort of munition, the conversation for new build F-16s must have been on the table at some
100%.
point.
I think the access to the 120D, 120C8 is probably an even bigger deal than the F-16.
Look at the list, right? Look at the list of countries. Like,
Yeah.
it's either countries that are already inducting new American fighters, or they're on the list for those who are being marketed new American fighters. Like Saudi Arabia has a DSA notice out for F-15EXs, for example. So with the exception of literally Sweden, which is a very unique case, Pakistan can either be a country that's already inducting American fighters, which it isn't, or it's a country that's on the list for promoting an American fighter, right? Or at least, green lighting a DSA notice in relation to one. So those are some of the big signs. And the other sign is obviously that the PAF has the existing infrastructure for the F-16 already. Like, remember, if you go back to the peace drive deal, the peace drive deal was in two parts. It was 18 up front with an option for 18 more, a mix of tougher than usual economic issues, plus the very intense counterinsurgency campaigns that happened at the time, which drew in a lot of funding from all the service arms in order to sustain, because we're talking about multi-year in high intensity counterinsurgency fighting, right? On top of, austerity measures at the time, that the 18 optional F-16s had to be dropped. But originally the plan was 36, and that plan was a trim from the original plan before the 2004 2005-ish earthquake that happened in Kashmir at the time. But even so, I believe it was 2005. So before that earthquake, the original plan was 55 F-16 CD Block 52s plus an option for 20 more. So you can see the PEF had to sort of trim its order book a bit in order to adjust with the fiscal realities of the time. I think now, they're probably going to look to at least get to that 36 number, potentially push it to 54 in total. So I would say that you could potentially see a deal for anywhere from 18 F-16s with an option for 18 more, right? Or maybe 16 F-16s with an option for 16 more. So about 32, 36 fighters. That's probably amongst, that's within the reason. The PF usually orders batches in 40, up to 40 anyways. And the other side of it is that, again, you have the existing infrastructure, because the thing is, a Block 72 and the Block 52 are functionally identical from an airframe and engine standpoint. It's literally the main difference is the electronics and in avionics and radar stack, essentially. Otherwise, you can pretty much operate the fighter out of the box, if not for the additional training and management for the electronics.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's more differences training than an entirely new type. And also the other potential avenue we could see maybe is the PAF looking at US EDAs as well. I'm not too sure how much you agree with that, but I don't see it as I see it as a nice way of bulking up the fleet for quite cheap as well.
Yeah,
Because, yeah,
the challenge with the EDAs though is that, or for our listeners, to the excess defense articles, like basically mothballed used American aircraft that have been put in storage. The one challenge is that the configuration of the PAF has, which is the Block 32, 42, 52, the Pratt and Whitney one, is not very common in the
yeah,
U.S. service. They primarily have been using the the slash 30, the slash 4 GE models basically,
yeah,
and as a result of that, we don't have many unless we make a switch or an additional engine line,
yeah, no,
which which could be untenable. It would be, it's not easy to sustain at this stage. They're probably going to have to seek new build ones. Of course, there is that scant possibility of those airframes in Iraq, for example. They're
yeah.
the same configuration, but with no US contractors on the ground, I don't know. I don't know if they're
I think it's a slim.
airworthy.
People tend to say the Iraq stuff as well, but I think it's sort of the main grip the US has influence-wise in terms of their air force. So I feel like losing that would probably be counterintuitive to US interests, even though right now it's not really doing a whole lot. But yeah, so I mean, possibly some EDAs if there are some. Yeah, but I forgot what I was saying. But yeah, so possibly some EDAs if there are some. But I think the bulk of it, as you mentioned, will be new build orders. But also the other thing, right, is there's still like the people tend to really not look too deep into this, but there's kind of like a gap, at least in terms of our public knowledge, but there's kind of like a gap in the PAF's fleet planning. Like we still have F7s, we still have Mirages, but also the thing that people tend to overlook is we're going to have retiring JF-17 Block 1s soon as well. And there's not really any, and also F-16s, right? And there's not really any sort of plan for these. Not publicly. Their 17 orders are sort of stalling. We saw the Block 3 order go from 50 to 30 to now 23. We're not really seeing any new build JF-17s come off the production line for Pakistan. So there's that gap. But also, the best aircraft to replace the F-16 for the PAF is just the F-16. So those squadrons that are used, that are so deeply knowledgeable about the F-16, have done all of their training on it and have all of their scenario and doctrines and everything set up around the F-16. The best platform for them is literally the F-16 anyway, and particularly because the US is guaranteed to support it for the next 40 to 50 years.
Absolutely. And I know, and I know our listeners will also then point towards, hey, what about the J-35? Now, the thing is, let's put even maturity and platform maturity aside. The issue is any stealth fighter at this point, whether it's J-35 or, Con or whatever you want, but let's say J-35 for this example, it would serve a very specific role in the offensive structure. So remember, you have a fighter with relatively limited payload capacity, because whatever you're going to house is going to be within the internal bay. Yes, in theory you could put it on the wings, but the thing is that the J-35 was not designed to be a beater, meaning that what you're going to put on the wings, you're going to have to make a trade-off in terms of airframe life, potentially structural durability and that kind of stuff, which might not be wise if you want to get the most out of your investment over the long term. So what you're going to use the J-35s and UCAVs and what have you is for that initial penetration, right? To go in, to maybe disrupt India's air defense posture, right? To create some sort of initial movement, to carve out a pathway for your crewed fighters, your manned fighters to go in and follow up with attack with strikes. And now in terms of those manned fighters, we actually, if you look at any of the other countries with a stealth fighter doctrine, minus the small NATO powers, because NATO powers are assuming, they operate with the assumption that they're eventually going to, collate and combine their forces in a fight. So I wouldn't use Romania and Czech Republic as an example, or even like a Finland, for example. But I would rather if you look at how the US operates or Israel operates, especially Israel, they sent the F-35s in to do the initial salvo and strikes. What came after that for the follow-up? It was the F-15s and F-16s, right? Now, in
Yeah.
the case of the PAF, we wrote about this in KUA. One option would be to use your JF-17s as the, range extension kit deployment platform. And that could be a pretty good approach, but you're pretty limited in terms of your range because it's a light fighter. So it's going to probably hit things from within Pakistan, basically. So you have maybe up to 100, maybe if you use cruise missiles up to 3 to 4 or 500 kilometers. Maybe if you stretch it, let's say you have a new generation Rad cruise missile, 700 kilometers, right? That's like your limit, right? In terms of how much you're going to be able to hit from within the JF-17, and your payload capacity will be like, 2 missiles per flight or what have you. The fighter you would prefer deploying in that mass salvo strike role after your initial stealth attack is going to be something like an F-16 or J-10. Now, the thing with the J-10 is that even though our units were configured as multi-role fighters, we did say that, the PF said that they can carry standoff range weapons. The way that fighter was designed for the PLA was as a very optimal air-to-air platform. And that's the main reason why the PAF bought it. It didn't buy it for the air-to-surface role. It really bought it for the fact that it could have that first look, first strike, or first look, first shot capability in an air-to-air role. So it's a very good air-to-air platform, right? If that. However, with the F-16 is that you have a good multi-role, very capable strike platform. And I think with the PAF this time around, I suspect they're going to, if they're going to, again, now there's a give and take. The US says, hey, you're not going to get the new AIM-120s and F-16V upgrade unless you buy new build F-16s. I think the PAF is going to come around and say, okay, we can get the new F-16s, but you're going to have to give us air-to-surface munitions. And I can see them really pushing for something like, obviously, the HARM for the suppression of and destruction of enemy air defense role, the small diameter bomb, the MALD decoy system, the good old bright cloud ECM.
Yeah.
Just actionable, chaff dispenser system. So I think those are the things the PEF would love to have on its F-16 fleet to be able to build that follow-on attack capability. So you basically have like maybe a split between J-10s and F-16s doing this, with the J-10s maybe taking on that more of that air-to-air role specifically, and the F-16s being the multi-role air-to-air, air-to-ground. But thing is, like, yeah, like people are, we're constantly hearing people, hey, like we should go walk away from the F-16, forget the F-16. But the thing is like, what platform do we have that's going to fill that role that you want the J-35 to fulfill? Like, if you want the J-35, then you want to use the J-35 for its best possible way, then you're going to need a fighter that follows up. Now, the Chinese have things like the J-16, the JL, the Sino flankers, basically. They have those platforms to carry those munitions, right? The Americans have the F-15s. The Saudis have F-15s. The Israelis have F-15s and F-16s. The Indians have the Su-30. What do we have, right? And really, the only platform that we have right now in our hand for this role is the F-16. Now, I know people are going to bring up, well, what about PFX? Look, we haven't seen PFX. No one has seen PFX. How many people within the PEF have seen PFX?
I don't think they know they've seen PF.
Like, to be serious, like, if you think PF is serious, where is the PF training? Where is the PEF preparation? Where's the operational side of the PEF that has to prepare for this prototype? Because I remember the days.
Where is the infrastructure?
Yeah, like I remember the days when the JF-17 was first flying. I remember 2003. I remember the PAF setting up the infrastructure for that in advance. It was on the news. They literally the hangars and everything. They said like, hey, Camera is going to be the prime testing zone for the prototype 1, and prototype 3, or prototype 5, or whatever it was, right? So the point being is that where have we heard anything about Camera making changes for the PFX?
Even forgetting all of that, right? People, if PFX is this indigenous next generation or whatever, like half-assed, half generation, whatever you want to call it, fighter. The biggest giveaway typically with these sort of projects is you'll see a dedicated testbed aircraft, right? The Europeans, they have an A320 for their ECRS Mark II program or whatever it is, so they can test Eurofighter radars on A320s. The Chinese have a AN-26 or something. I always forget the designation. They've got their own. The Indians have an A320 that does this. The US has 757 and 737. Korea has a 737. What do we have? We've got a real estate project. That's what we've got. But yeah, so this stuff is all vaporwave. I call it vaporwave. This stuff is all
I
vaporwave.
would be interested, like a bit of a side tangent, but I would be interested if the PAF starts leveraging hard against the Chinese and says, look, we'll buy J35s and give you that export push, but you got to give us J16s. Otherwise, we're not going to get the most use out of, out of these.
For them, the J10s are as good as nothing. Like the J10s are nothing for them. Their main sort of strike packages revolve around a stealth element and then heavy elements in the form of J16s. Now let's just put all our eggs in the J35 basket for a second, right? Let's just assume that all of that's going to happen. Firstly, when do we even get the J35, right? The Chinese, sure, they've got massive production line and mega factory or whatever, but their primary goal is going to be firstly building up their fleet. They're going to want to induct it to themselves. So firstly, that's a couple of years already. But secondly, the Air Force is going to want to see how the Chinese resolve all of the issues that are going to come with a new aircraft, right? All of the teething problems. And particularly something as advanced and something that has such a massive supply chain involved, the Chinese are going to want to resolve all of that. And also the Air Force is going to want to see how that's all resolved. Because if you think back to and you're going to correct me on this, Bilal, but I think it was what were the H4s, the bombers?
It's like it was their local version of the IL-28 or something, yeah.
Yeah, this is like this isn't me digging up like skeletons out of the closet, but this is a very real possibility that, the PF inducts a platform. They feel that the support isn't there, the capabilities aren't there, whatever, then they have to go and return them at a lower cost or whatever. It's a headache, right? And we want to avoid all of that and see how the Chinese resolve all of these things and then look at inducting this.
The other side of it is that, people are really they love pushing the narrative. J35s are going to come up soon. We're this close to inducting them.
2024, 2025.
How are we going to induct a fighter that we haven't even tested within Pakistan yet? Like, you know what? At least with the J10 and even the J11 series, enough, we were able to test them within Pakistan because they kept coming to exercises.
Yeah.
So we knew how they would fare in our dust environments, our heat environments. We knew we had a pretty good understanding, or we built a pretty good understanding of the maintenance procedures by observing the Chinese. The problem is with any stealth fighter, whether it's J35 or F-35, you have to put in such a level of investment in the testing itself. That's like a multi-million-dollar project, by the way, because if this is a fighter that's going to stay with you for the long term. So you better make sure it lands in Pakistan, number one, right? Because we're not talking about fourth generation fighters here. We're talking about like a fifth gen stealth fighter, because you have to test what the skin tolerances are going to be. And what kind of facilities will we need? How well can we scale those facilities? How can we keep those facilities safe? We don't want BrahMos strikes hitting our J5 hangars. We have to evaluate things like, for example, how do they operate within our runways and stuff. Like you'd be surprised that to test this kind of kit takes a lot of work itself. It is a multi-million-dollar project. We did see a random report on the forum about like a WS-21 engine being bought. That's like one small step, right? That's what the possibly to write the manuals for the PAF people to that could be part of the wider evaluation process. You can tell that the fact they have to import an engine, get a PAF team to understand the engine, to write manuals on it, to train on it, before they even evaluate the fighter, speaks volumes of how long the testing is going to be. Because in all likelihood, I can guarantee you, there might potentially be a small project team with a J35 that comes to Pakistan for a few years, and they're going to send back so much feedback to the Chinese, 100%. That
100%.
For our environment, we're going to need this, we're going to need this, we're going to need this. And and then the PLA is going to have their own feedback. They're going to say, we're going to need this, we're going to need this. You're going to probably end up waiting for another block of the aircraft before you're going to have one that's acceptable for use, because this is not a simple jet, right? So, I mean, the timeline for a next generation fighter induction is quite far. And even the PAF, to Alan Warren's in the recent Air Force's monthly piece, said, look, we're still looking into it. We have the picture. We have the picture on the thing.
A vision. He's got a
vision.
Quantum analysis and all this buzzword. And just on that point, right? It took the J20. When was the first flight? I think 2012. It's whatever it is. It's taken the J20 over a decade to be able to be improved enough to where the Chinese are willing to use it as a front line. In fact, even if you look at a picture of the original J20 and the newest J20s rolling off the line, it is a world of difference in production quality, in materials, in coatings, in everything. It's effectively, as you mentioned, a new block, right? And now, if we end up becoming so heavily reliant, we need to save all our money for J35. We need to put in J35. all of this sort of stuff. What are you going to do with the 50 or so block ones that will eventually need to be retired before all of that happens? What are you going to do with the X amount of F-16s, the last, what is it, 212 F-7 PG squadrons, the last 12 Mirage squadrons? There's still a ton of the PAF that needs to be refreshed and needs to be planned for. So, and that's the other thing, right, is making this jump ahead to the 5th gen without having a setup to work around it, right? Without having the aircraft and the assets to build up the base of the PAF, sort of, and then looking at the offensive. It's a silly move, you know. Then you have an
Actually,
effort.
this is interesting. Interesting. So think about Algeria.
Yes.
Algeria is a Su-57 order, right? However, what's coming before the Su-57? It's the Su-34
Yes.
on top of their Su-30s. So Algeria has a plan for
Yes,
stealth
Algeria
fighters.
has a plan. We're just going with the flow.
So just think about Algeria has a plan. China obviously has a plan because China is looking at it from the standpoint. Look, even the Navy, which needs the J-35, which is the main customer, but let's say, you know, for argument's sake, it's just the Navy. They have their Sinoflankers to back it up, right? The U.S. Navy, you have your F-35s, you have your Super Hornets. So the reality is that the PAF knows this, right? It knows that, okay, just the stealth fighters on their own, they can provide the initial salvo, which is great. For a preemptive strike, you have satellites that are coming up. You can pick up near hourly refreshes of what India's vector movements. You pick up a vector, you get Rocket Force Command, and you get PAF stealth fighter units going in, attacking it, neutralize, great. Now you've escalated the situation. Now you need to bring in the heavy guns to come in and back it up. Where are those assets? Right? That's the issue. And the thing is, PF, it wants to work towards that, but it has to work with what it has.
Yeah.
But the point being is that what does the PF have on its disposal? So it has 2 medium weight platforms. One is optimized really good for air-to-air. I'm going to give the J-10 its credit. I think it's good for that role.
Absolutely.
And one is a good multi-role strike-capable fighter, which is the F-16. Its main bottleneck has been the lack of munitions access. So we can't expect the US to release something like the JSSM, for example, unless there's like a software mod for countries like us, you know, not like tier 2 countries compared like out of NATO that they might consider releasing, but there is unlikely. SDBs I think are plausible because we're already making our own SDB at this point.
9Xs will be a big
9Xs for sure. We have that capability already. And that's the thing. That's the thing that J-10 has provided us is that, look, we can go to the US and look, the J-10 already gives everything we need from a technology standpoint. Now it's a capability question. We have J-10s. They're good for the air-to-air, but we need the heavy assault fighter, right? And the F-16s are the best fit for the role. Israel has proven out that you can use them really effectively for the role. And I think for the PAF, if it can get, you know, 3 to 4, ideally 5, that's really pushing it. But 3 to 4 block 72 units /V units, it would be in a pretty good place to then absorb the J-35 down the line.
Yeah.
And get the most use out of it.
Yeah, and it would be really interesting to see in terms of new stuff whether we do end up getting anything like harm or because there was back during the
there were reports of the
there
harm.
were, and in fact there's a US Marine intelligence report as well that also cites the PF having harm. So it'd be really interesting.
Like the PF has always imagined the F-16. So remember, like if you go back to pre-Pressler, and this goes to the challenge of dealing with the US, where we have to also preface that as well. We have to discuss that.
Yeah,
but you go back to pre-Pressler, is that once the PF looked at lightweight fighters like the F-20, the Sabre 2 project, which was a precursor to the JF-17 conceptually, it dropped those ideas because it felt they were like, I mean, with F-20 couldn't complete the testing, so that was out of the picture. But with the Sabre 2, the issue was that the costs were ballooning and the relative performance you're going to get out of it was not up to the point and worth the investment. And the F-16's costs at this time were dropping ridiculously low because the production was insane. So what the PF said was like let's just build our fleet around the F-16. So in this alternative future, if not for Pressler, would have been that the main workhorse fighter of the PAF would have been the F-16. And remember, I remember this article, and you can Google it as well if you search through the archives at Flight Global, basically, if you have access to it. It's basically in the 90s, Air Chief Marshal Qureshi, basically, or Qureshi, I'm not sure, but the one in the early 90s basically said that the PAF would have essentially negotiated for another 50 F-16s on top of the Peacegate 4 units. So basically, once the 110 were inducted from Peacegate 3 and 4, they would have asked for another 50 F-16s on top of that. So basically the fleet was like going to be as big as Turkey's fleet, basically, at 160, right? And that's your multi-role fighter. And now the picture changes. Now you have a good multi-role fighter. Then instead of worrying about the light air defense issue, because now the F-16s are going to handle it, you start focusing on the niche roles. And that in that world, in that scenario, I would contend is that the PAF, had it gotten the F-16 fleet to its full number, it would have looked at something like a Chinese GH-7 or a British Tornado.
The Corsair.
Sorry?
The Corsair.
Yeah, or the British Tornado, right?
But that's what they wanted
for the attack role.
Was the A7 for the
That was the original. That's what they wanted, right?
Yeah.
But by the 90s, it was out of production, right? So basically, the two platforms that would have been available by that point were the Tornado from the UK, which we did test in lieu of the F-16s, by the way. Unfortunately, it just wasn't good for the multi-role need, but for the strike role, it would have been good. And that could have probably been pursued had the F-16s been inducted, or if money was a problem, the GH-7 or the FBC-1 from China, which would have served that bomb truck role. Oh, that was like the PF understood at that time, like this is how you're going to have to figure it out. But the thing is, and this is where the US really threw us in for a loop, basically, was that Pressler, the sanctions, the constant pivoting in policy does mess up planning. And it's really tough for the PAF to really lead on America. And we have to give that point, is that this is why I think this is where, and rightfully so, the animosity towards the US comes from. Everything they've done to basically shaft Pakistan was to favor India. And at this stage, this year, you found out that India was not able to deliver or refuses to deliver. And if you're a Pakistani policymaker, like not the kind who would bend, but the kind who would really stand up for the country's interests, you would say that, look, in the 60s, we were willing to fight the Soviets, but we had an issue with India we needed to solve, and you couldn't back us up. But had the Soviets attacked, we would have come in. And you want the proof of that? Is that when they did attack, we did come in, right? And then when you had your whole issue with the Taliban, we were again there to back you up, and we took the brunt of the damage. And then you guys cut a deal with the Taliban, right? And then now we're at a situation where you basically, because India can't fight China, that's really the issue here.
In terms of other equipment, I think the PAF is really going to start pushing for stuff like MALD and also Bright Cloud, but because we see this shift onto electronics.
I think it's a lot of the stuff we already have, or we can make. Like, thing is like America has no reason to block it except just to make the F-16s weaker. Otherwise, we are making our own SDP through the Azov 81 LR program, where we can make a MALD through the Kajam platform, basically. Or the Taimur, right? We can make them out. It's not a big deal.
It's doable, right? Yeah. Even by the S3 platform.
There's no disruptive technology here. That's, I think, the key that Pakistan's policymakers are going to say, is that the PF is going to say, look, none of the things on this list is disruptive. Even the JASSM. Dude, we have ROD too. Like, what capability are you stopping us from having by denying this?
I guess that Americans just don't necessarily, the fear is always there that these guys are going to take these weapons and put a nuke on them, and I'm guessing the Americans don't necessarily don't want that risk.
I think now they might evaluate it, but they have a more nuanced evaluation, in the sense that, and this goes back to the previous episode with Asim and I, we were saying, look, America could be fine with giving Pakistan the deterrence capability, the capability to be able to fight off India anytime, on the condition that it focuses its energies elsewhere, not on India. Meaning that if the idea is that you equip Pakistan well enough that India doesn't feel it can leverage an advantage and is basically sort of forced to focus on China, that's fine. On the condition that Pakistan then does not have any machinations or planning against India. And I think it goes back to the implicit condition in the 60s, which people sort of overlook, is that yes, the US did sanction Pakistan during the 65 war. However, that equipment that America transferred to Pakistan was really meant to deter was really meant to fight the Soviets. It wasn't meant for India. In fact, if you go back to our episode with Osman Shabir and Yawar Mazhar, they're saying that when the US released the F-104 to Pakistan, they were marketing the F-104 to India at the same time. Just because the crown jewel for any American policymaker has always been India. But now the issue is that at this stage, because it's a combination of factors, it's because the Indians have not delivered on China. They've shown a propensity to want to maintain their own independent posture, and America doesn't like that. That's going to mean equipping Pakistan.
Yeah. I mean, if they're controlling the 120D, I'm sure they can figure that aspect out. So I think we can't talk about F-16s without talking about the two most important parts of it, is the sanction-proofing and also the financing. So in terms of sanction-proofing, you might be better positioned to talk about this, particularly with the Block 52 procurement, but it seems like the PF strategy is just buying as much as they can of stuff and then holding on to stockpiles of it to protect themselves.
Basically, yeah, like what ends up what the PF has basically done since I think the Peace Drive program, was they would basically buy the F-16s with a large stockpile of spare parts. So they would probably look at it at a 5-year or 10-year cycle, and that's when you get those sustainment contracts coming in time to
Yeah.
time on the DSCA. And they're pretty hefty. There was like
Yeah.
400 million, like they're pretty big. Is because the PF is front loading a lot of support, so that it could basically sustain the fleet for longer periods of time, so it's not dependent on some just-in-time sort of arrangement, which is
Yeah.
obviously not going to work. The other side is that it can hedge by doing a parallel order of J-10s, and this is where it comes to the credit of the ones who made the decision to buy the J-10s, to establish that, hey, we have an alternative. And the thing is that it doesn't protect you from the sanctions, but it does distribute the workload. So now your F-16s are not your sole air-to-air, air-to-surface units. They could focus on air-to-surface while your J-10s take on the air-to-air in that hypothetical attack role.
Yeah.
So you have that, and that's really the thing. Like, that's really the goal you want to focus on. And the other side of it is that the F-16s are such a widely adopted platform at this point. And that's the story about certain American platforms, is that even if you get sanctioned by America, there are ways to support the platform.
I mean, Iran supported F-14s, and Americans were the only operators.
Yeah,
tried
exactly.
to destroy all the stocks.
Exactly, right? The thing is with the F-16s, is even the newer blocks, I mean, maybe with the Block 72, there might be some difficulty with the electronic stack. However, when it comes to things like managing the airframe, the engines, the PF already knows how it's going to support them.
Yeah, but even in terms of the electronic stack, a lot of the stuff is moving on to solid state stuff, so it's significantly more reliable. So you're not even worrying about necessarily how many spares and stockpiles of XYZ you need, because a lot of it is just genuinely more reliable. So you've got stuff that needs to be replaced on certain time conditions or on condition. And the other thing is, as well, as the PF retires some of the older F-16s, that also creates a flow of spare parts, because the PAF isn't just going to park those airframes upright. They'll disassemble them if they can, or they'll take off the stuff from them that's still serviceable, that still has life, and put it on a shelf, recondition it, and stack it on a shelf to support.
I mean, it depends to what extent the ABs are having commonality from a base infrastructure, base structure standpoint with the CDs. I'm not sure, because as you can tell, the CDs have insane amounts of life in them, right? So I think the production standards and inputs that went into those might be a bit different from the ABs, potentially. But I would say this: look, at the end of the day, it's supportable, and that goes with most American.
But even if it's stuff like servos, stuff like that, there will be some stuff that can be carried forward. I'm sure of it.
It's basically closely derived with the civilian S-70i
it's supportable,
platform.
it's manageable.
So as long as you're not on the most with the exception of the few years after the nuclear tests, Pakistan has never been on such a restrictive, an incredibly restrictive sanctions list, except for those few years when the Saudi money had to come in.
North Korea, but even then, even the North Koreans, they are sanctioned to the balls, but they still managed to smuggle in American helicopters and
I don't think America
and
wants
equipment
to.
that would have not been allowed. So it's all doable, right? The PAF is
the way the Americans are now perceiving Pakistan.
It's all doable anyway.
I think, and this is where this conversation we should have also steered into, is why would you even release the AIM-120C8 if not to deter India? Who else would this be used against? The Taliban, right? And I think anything about the current U.S. administration and the way and remember, I think one thing people will say is that, once this administration passes, things can change to an extent, but they're thoroughly reworking the U.S. system right now. The U.S. bureaucracy and all the people within the Pentagon and State Department, those people are being swapped out with people with similar ideological leanings. So these guys, I think, for a decade, I would say up to a decade, are going to have a similar disposition. Yeah.
I think one interesting thing to discuss might actually be how this could tie into the SHORAD's requirement, because we've got 498 AMRAAMs of the original 500. So that's a significant stockpile still there. I don't know whether you can modernize and upgrade the C5s to the C8 or D standard. Of course, it's a common airframe, but there's a lot that
we're basically offering the NASAMS platform to the PF as well. Yeah, and I believe that version was basically just reusing AMRAAMs as it was. So it would have been a pure SHORAD system. Whereas the current surface launch AMRAAM is more of short to medium range, because they've produced now,
I think it was Raytheon,
SAM specific AMRAAMs for the role with the wider rocket motor. However, I think because the thing is like
Yeah.
the underlying stack to reuse the AMRAAMs as it's a pure SAM is already there. You have the TPS-77 radars, which are multimodal,
Yeah.
both
AMRAAM,
surveillance and targeting capable.
Yeah.
You just basically need the core interface system, right? Like you need obviously you have the launch vehicles are not the issue. You can have those, but it's just the launcher
Yeah.
and the mission computers and that core stack, right? So that could just be
Yeah.
tied in. And maybe at some level this might be we're getting the this could also just we could be
Launcher.
completely wrong about the F-16s, and this could just literally be in relation to a surface launch C-8 basically.
Yeah, just strap up the Hilux.
That would be the bare minimum, I would say. That's like the floor. Like if anything from this conversation, it would be we're getting surface launch C8s, right? We're the only customers of
Yeah,
which.
that would be great. But it's so
Beyond
unlikely
that, I would say that would be the ruse where you're basically
quite
repurpose the C5s into a surface launch AMRAAM system by just getting the configuration set, and then maybe even induct some of the specific ground launched AMRAAMs as well to maybe shore it out to like your 40-50 kilometer range. Yeah. I mean, because we had people might think we've been plotting in the background about this, but we've had like offhand conversations over the years.
I think that sort of summarizes our conversation for the day. This has been a bit more of a conversational podcast compared to our normal format, hasn't it?
And I think the big one, and I think a few people have mentioned it even on the forum and as well as ourselves, is that look, one of the biggest value propositions of the F-16 is that it's an unsung strike capable fighter. It's like really good for the strike role. It's just that we never been able to use it in that role except for counterinsurgency. And what's ironic, maybe interesting, is that because we haven't used it in that role for that much, is that compared to Israel uses them all the time for whatever for obvious reasons.
Yeah,
but because we haven't used our airframes for that role that much, they're pretty fresh. We haven't stressed them. Yeah.
We don't even, they might not have, during the sanction-prone periods as well, they wouldn't have flown a ton either.
So one other cool interesting thing is that with
young
the Block
airframes,
2s,
potentially, in terms of airframe life, because
on top of that and upgrade them to the
you don't count aircraft life by how old the aircraft is. Right? If it's a 50-year-old airframe, that doesn't mean as much as the amount of cycles.
So, for example, we have the DB-110 the reconnaissance pod, we have a sniper targeting pod. Now, granted, we've been using those for counterinsurgency. However, once you factor in the fact that Pakistan is procuring an imaging constellation system from China, then they, are evidently trying to build the entire real-time ISR plus target acquisition framework, right? Similar to what Ukraine has, where you can connect your satellite data with your electronic intelligence data, with your drone feeds, with your F-16 based DB-110 feeds or imagery. Then you have this multimodal, multi-timed, multi-location sort of, not location, but say multi-time, multimodal picture of your target areas. And then you start tracking those over a period of days, weeks, months, years. You begin to develop a really good understanding of India's deployment movements and stuff. And then you pair that information with your different attack vectors. So that could be your Army Rocket Force Command. Obviously, we could have a future discussion on how the subsonic cruise missiles are very high value assets within our inventory, and how having the right ISR plus target acquisition net will get the most out of them. Then you pair that with having a proper follow-on strike capability through your F-16s, supported with the J-10 and top cover, combined with then finally the crown jewel, which would be your stealth fighter for the initial strike. So suddenly you're building that really robust attack capability, right? And that's the thing that kind of the Pakistan might be conveying to all the stakeholders, whether it's China, US, Saudi Arabia, whoever, that if we have this kind of capability, no one's going to touch us. And then we can be free to focus on what you care about, which is our economic growth, whether it's policing Afghanistan, whether it's dealing with the Middle Eastern issues or what have you. But whatever it might be, I think that's the case that we've basically been delivering, and that could be the thing that Pakistan's working towards. That concludes our episode. Thanks, Arslan, for joining me. And thank you again to our listeners. And, we look forward to hearing from you.
Absolutely.
And we'll start posting the question posts as well
for the third time that
episode onwards. I think for the next one, we can probably hone in more on the SHORAD question, Arslan.
Yeah.
So take care, everyone, and bye.